Hello, and welcome to our viewers in the United States and Europe. I'm Katja Donovan, Executive Director of 1014, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second episode of our new virtual series, Resilience and Adaptation 2.0, which is brought to you by the American Council on Germany and 1014. With this new series, we would like to revisit some of the topics of the original Resilience and Adaptation discussions that we launched after the outbreak of COVID-19 3 years ago. How much has or has not changed as a result of the pandemic? Have any of these changes proven to be sustainable as we have emerged from COVID?
And I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. Today, we're going to be looking much more closely at the future of work. I think it's fair to say that the pandemic was an inflection point for the way in which we live and the way in which we work, and that it particularly impacted commerce and business. Companies and workers had to adapt to new ways of doing things in order to survive. As we reflect on the impact of the pandemic and the future of work, there are a host of questions, including, with the pandemic in our rearview mirror, what are the lasting changes to the way in which we work? What role will artificial intelligence have on changes to the work environment? And more broadly, do the current geopolitical changes and threat of high inflation impact the way in which we work? How do unions react to these changes? Are there differences in the United States and Europe?
Here with us to try and answer some of these questions are Thorben Albrecht and Annelise Orleck. Thorben is the Policy Director at IG Metall, the German metal workers' trade union. From 2014 to 18, he served as State Secretary at the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Annelise is History Professor at Dartmouth College. Her current research focuses, among many other areas, on a new global labor movement. A warm welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
And to our audience, if you would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. Let us know who your questions are directed to. We will do our best to integrate them into the conversation.
So to set the stage, I'd like to maybe ask each of you the same opening question. And Thorben, I thought maybe we could start with you. What are the biggest and most lasting changes that the pandemic brought for the workforce?
Well, I think the pandemic worked as an accelerator of some trends we've seen before, and some trends became very visible. The use of technology, new technologies, especially digital technology, became very visible for a lot of workers. And we could see that the power of platforms, not only as marketplaces, but also as employers, increased during the pandemic, and platforms like food delivery, etc., became more important and could grow the customers. So gig work was also on the rise during the pandemic, and is, I think, there to stay. But we also could see how vulnerable some supply chains globally are, and how much geoeconomics play into the development of our economies, and that is also affecting, of course, the way we work. And this geoeconomics, in a way, are connected also to the issue of greening our economies, which plays a huge role in Europe and changing a lot of our sectors. The IG Metall, my union, is active in fundamentally. So I think there are a lot of trends that might have been there before, but became much more visible and much more developing faster in quite an area of fields which we are now dealing with. And I think so the pandemic has been some kind of a accelerator of a lot of trends we see in the world of work and for the future of work too.
So, Annelise, from your perspective, do you agree that the pandemic basically served as a sort of accelerator for pre-existing trends that you were observing as you watched the labor market in the US and elsewhere?
It was an accelerator for certain trends, and most importantly, as Thorben pointed out, the rise of digital and remote work, which I think has become more expansive and widely accepted in the period after the pandemic. In particular, I think we're seeing more and more companies that do not have headquarters at all. My son works for one. There's one CEO in Australia and one in Germany and one in California and one in New York. So there is no place. So I think there's more of that. And we're seeing already existing companies go to that. I know Airbnb went to that. They decided to get rid of having a headquarters. So remote work is one thing. And I think for some of these new corporations, large and also small startups, the argument has been that this is important for the greening of the economy. I mean, during the lockdown, we found that greenhouse gas emissions had gone down as a result of people not having to commute anymore. That has started to change in the aftermath, but I think remote work is certainly going to continue to be something that's argued for as a way of reducing the pollution costs of commuting. I think, though, that there are some changes that happened that we might not have expected. And, I've written about the movement for a living wage around the world, but, most certainly in the United States and in the US, the wage had been stuck for 40 years and it had been declining. The US minimum wage has not been officially increased since 2007. So all of that led to, an increasingly hard-pressed working class. Something that's interesting about the pandemic is that the labor shortages have, in the US at least, dramatically driven up the bottom wage. And so jobs that Fight for 15 was struggling as a movement to get a $15 starting wage for are now starting at $18, $20, $21 an hour. And so I think the US is in that sense starting to be more comparable to some of the Northern European economies, which it certainly was not before. And the final thing is, I think the entrance of Gen Z into the labor force coming out of an era, their working career starting during the pandemic, so starting remote, and now, flooding into workplaces. They think about work differently, and they think about work not in the way that, let's say, my Great Depression era parents did, where you got one job and you stayed at it for the rest of your life, but rather as something that you build a life with and around. Work isn't the be all and end all for them. And so I think all of those things mark continuity. Certainly the gig economy is one, but even with gig jobs in this country, at least, and largely as a result of Gen Z, we're seeing a resurgent labor movement for the first time in decades. So I think all of those things mark differences wrought by the pandemic.
So we will certainly pick up on a number of the topics that each of you raised over the course of the next 40 or 50 minutes in our conversation, but I'd like to maybe pick up on just two strands right now. Annelise, you were talking about the increase in wages that we've seen here in the US and a real pressure to raise the minimum wage. Thorben, have you observed sort of a similar trend in Germany? Is that one positive maybe that has come out of the pandemic?
Definitely. We can see that the trend towards labor shortages, not only with the high-skilled worker, but overall coming together with a new approach of younger people demanding the workers' rights, and the political debate that has changed too, has led to some very important wage increases, which have been necessary in the inflation we've seen, of course. But there's been a mix of government measures. In Germany, for example, the minimum wage was increased from 10.50 euros to 12 euros by the government. That was announced even before the pandemic. We could see that gig workers have been starting to organize more frequently, demanding higher wages, but also some of the fundamental workers in areas like health or other services sectors where they did not have collective bargaining agreements in the past and very low wages, they have managed to achieve quite huge wage increases during and after, especially after the pandemic. And this, together with some other government measures, I think helped also to weaken the effects of inflation. But still, we see that low-income families suffer most from inflation, because the percentage of, in Europe and Germany, inflation is especially bad when it comes to food, when it comes to energy, when it comes to living. So households that have to spend a higher percentage for these kind of expenditures suffered more from the pandemic. So I think, yes, there is a positive trend with increases, with stronger trade unions, but still the inequalities that are there are not weakening, but on the contrary, people at the low end of the income scale suffer most.
And I think one hidden aspect that of the pandemic's effects we haven't talked about is a disproportionate effect on some of those low-wage jobs, most of whose workers are women and often are single mothers. And so the double day that has often always afflicted them was more intensive during the pandemic, as people became sick, as workers became sick, especially since so many of them work in essential worker jobs where they weren't able to work from home. So the disproportionate impact on women, particularly mothers, I think is something worth mentioning.
Yeah, especially what we could see is that some of the care work that has been done before the pandemic by the state with kindergartens, with schools, etc., was given back to the families. And that was, this extra load was also very unequally distributed between men and women. So we could see very clearly that women took most of the load that was given extra in the pandemic, because the public services were not there at that time. And that even increased the gender gap there.
So we'll definitely come back to the social implications of all of this, because I think that that's incredibly important and something that we need to spend some time talking about. But from sort of things that both of you said in your opening comments, you talked about sort of flex work and the fact that Annelise, you said some places don't even have headquarters anymore, that everything is done remotely. You've both talked a little bit about sort of this trend of working from home. One of our viewers actually anticipated that I wanted to ask a question in this direction, or a follow-up question, because they've written, there seems to be more of a focus on feeling comfortable in the workplace with things such as standing desks, comfortable seating, and remote working having been introduced in recent years to keep staff happy and motivated. The modern workplace is now all about social collaboration and rising tech trends. However, some employers are demanding that their employees return to the office. Will workers go back to the office, or will they just find a job that they can do from home? And I guess the question that I wanted to ask both of you, in addition to that, is, we're certainly seeing in New York that the finance community is returning to the office 4 or 5 days a week in droves, other sectors not as much. What's your take on what the staying power of this kind of flexible workplace might be?
I think that you could see different trends. Some people also wanted to go back to the offices, at least at some days during the week, while others felt quite comfortable with working most of the time at home. So this is from the worker side. And then from the employer side, you can also see different trends. Some are happy to get rid of expensive office buildings, while others want people to come back to the offices. So what I think we see is that this flexibility issue has always been something where employers and employees or trade unions did fight over who has the saying, what kind of flexibility do you want? And this is becoming even more complicated as work forces are becoming more different from or more diverse in this sense, as well as employers have different approaches. But when we talk about what the Gen Z and Annelise talked about it, expect from the workplaces, I think it's not just about remote work or being in the office. It's much more. It's a lot about what is the sense and meaning of my job. It's becoming more and more important. Also, when it comes to how to combine life and work life, it's not only about where do I work, but also how much do I work. in Germany and in a lot of European countries, we have a huge debate about shouldn't we go into a 4-day work week? And there's a huge movement from parts of the employers who want to increase their employer attractivities, but from a lot of workers and some trade unions too. So I think it's quite a set of expectations from workers, which now with the labor shortages find the way to the public and to the negotiations with the employers.
I also think there's a difference between large old school companies and newer startups. And I think not having the cost of a headquarters is giving startups an advantage and a chance to find their feet and build in a way that was less possible when you did have all the expenses of startups. And I've heard of startups that, for example, experiment in this moment when, as you mentioned, the financial services companies in New York and other manufacturing companies for sure trying to get people back on site. And so they've had experiments with co-working spaces. They haven't hired headquarters, but they've rented co-working spaces and brought employees in. And from what I've heard, and this is nothing scientific, these are just anecdotal reports, the productivity went down, not up. And so I think it really depends on the kind of company, the kind of work. Obviously, for service work, for many kinds of teaching, for hotel and restaurant work, and for many kinds of manufacturing, you have to have people on site. But in the age of increasingly tech and digital manufacturing and work, less so than before. So my guess is that remote work is not going away. Flex work is not going away. One new trend that I've been hearing about is unlimited paid time off, right? As a policy that many new companies are incorporating. That's very, very different, obviously, in the US, which was notorious for giving workers very few days off over the course of the year. Now, in some companies, I've heard workers say this is just a ruse because we can't really take the time off. And if we decide to leave, we can't get bought out as we can get bought out for time off that we haven't taken under the old policy. But in other companies, they're really having workers take the time off they need. They're trusting them to do their work, even if they take that time off. And I think that fits very well with the kinds of attitudes toward work that Thorben was saying Gen Z has.
I think, what people are talking about is this focus on a more people-centered approach to workplace transformation. I think that's what you alluded to in your statements. You're everyone is trying to allow for better work-life balance, and it's also trying to increase ownership in what's being done in the labor. Sort of how do you do this with a new generation coming into the workforce, and then of course remote work is a tool, but it's also a challenge. I think when you think about loyalties to the employer. I mean, you used to create this in the traditional employment situation over years by going to work every day and seeing your coworkers and all of this. So maybe you can just dive in just one more time, sort of to say how is this all gonna play out? How do you maintain a happy workforce in the future?
I think it's a lot about working conditions, but how positive working conditions are designed is very different from one sector to the other. Let's say, for example, let's take a very traditional sector like the steel sector. In Germany, we say we need better working conditions there too, and people cannot do remote work there. They will still have to go to a steel mill, which will be looking completely different because it's a green hydrogen powered one and not with coal any longer, but still people have to be at the place there. That's are the places where we start demanding for shorter working hours, to also give them more flexibility. In other areas, you have a trend towards more possibilities for flexibility. And even in manufacturing, if I look at the car industry, which is quite large in Germany, of course, we can see that the number of people that have to be on site producing, assembling cars will decrease with the change from combustion engine to electric engines. But what will grow will be software engineers, because the car of the future will be designed around more software than around an engine. So you will have more software engineers who then, of course, don't have to live in Wolfsburg, the large Volkswagen site any longer, but can work and live in Berlin, where you might have more software engineers anyway. So I think there are also trends to getting to more flexibility. And of course, we have to look at sectors like the healthcare sectors or childcare sectors, where we see in Germany, at least, that a lot of people, and mainly women working there, they drop out after a couple of years before reaching the pensions age, because the job is so demanding and stress is so high that we really have to find new ways of working, of having more carers in the same place for the number of clients, children, or patients. So I think we really have to look sector to sector to improve the working conditions, and it might be different in detail, but it's all about having a better work-life balance. Don't have too long working hours, not too stressful work, and I think it's around these kind of issues.
Yeah. Annelise, I have a viewer question on teamwork. Maybe I throw that in before you answer it.
Sure.
You can answer that as well. The viewer is interested in, how does remote work affect team mentality and the willingness to listen and collaborate with others?
Okay.
So,
I think each company handles that differently, and they have mechanisms for developing teamwork. I've seen remote companies where there are retreats, there are special events, occasional co-working spaces, those kinds of things. But also, the nice thing about online and remote work is that teams can also have breakout groups and work together. So I don't think it's having a negative effect on teamwork. I suppose in some places it is. I think Thorben's comment is extremely important in terms of looking at sectors, because the care work situation and here I know the United States and the UK. I don't know the situation in Germany or Northern Europe. I'd be curious to find out more. But care work, caring for, both in the healthcare sector and caring for young children, pre-K teaching and childcare. We're in a complete crisis. We have the United States and the UK have serious shortages in both of those areas. I would go so far as to say and again, this is not the product of intensive study, but just what I've learned from conversations and observation, that the healthcare sectors in both countries are near collapse. And I think, COVID exacerbated that, but underpayment exacerbated that, as Thorben said, overwork. And also, I have to say that the thing we haven't mentioned, which is a bit of an elephant in the room, because we've talked about tech changes and we've talked about COVID, what we haven't talked about is the very damaging effects of 40 years of neoliberal political and economic philosophy. And so, those philosophies which made workers interchangeable, disposable, developed management strategies that treated workers as, in very, very, very disrespectful ways. I think all of those things are up for discussion now and are driving a new labor movement, particularly in those sectors where people can't do it remotely. And also farm workers. That's a big one. So I think all of those things matter. And if you start talking about the people who do that level of work, the direct face-to-face service work, care work, farm work, then we also have to talk about immigration policy, because most of that work in the US and the UK and perhaps Germany as well is done by immigrants who have not been able to take advantage of legislative changes or even for a time the negotiated contracts by labor unions, although that's starting to change.
With regard to how do you treat workers? Just like to fold in another viewer question, and the question is, with more work from home, who pays for the extra workspace and equipment now needed in the home? That, of course, can be like your computer, can be your desk, but could probably also be the childcare that you're basically delivering on the go. So these extra costs, who is bearing them? Is that the workers or that the company, or what do you see? Thorben, maybe you want to.
Yeah, I think the legal situation in Germany is quite clear. If you're asked to work from home on a regular basis, then it's the employer who has to pay for it. But if workers demand it, it's more complicated. And we are now in Germany discussing both changing the legal framework for that, as well as negotiating collective agreements or company agreements on how this is dealt with. And I think it's a fair issue, and it doesn't stop with their computer, etc. It's also the question: how long do you work from home? Does it mean that you need a decent chair and a decent table, a desk to work from, because there are health issues involved also if you work longer hours at home. So I think there are a lot of things where are being discussed now and started in the pandemic, and arrangements are found now for these kind of issues, because yeah, it's important to make sure that you have workplaces at home that are healthy, and then don't put too much burden on the worker. I mean, if it's the workers wish to work from home, I think I can expect some participation in costs and etc., but definitely not 100%. It has to be always an employer's participation there too.
What I've seen is there's a difference between contract workers or gig workers, even in remote work, and full-time workers. So the companies will pay for equipment, even chairs, desks, for full-time workers, but not for contract workers. Or maybe they'll give them, you know, a little bit of the cost of those that equipment.
That's one of the, I think, worrisome signs that we see, you know, with like traditional employment models kind of on the decline, to the rise of more gig workers and companies just, hiring people just for a task and then, but not really taking care of them in the traditional way, at least. So with that, we have one last viewer question on our topic of employment models. And it also relates to the worker shortage. And the viewer would like to know if you're seeing companies sort of hoarding labor on both sides of the Atlantic and retaining jobs artificially, sort of to prepare for a future shortage. So do you see these trends? And of course, in Germany, we have this, we call it Kurzarbeit model. Maybe, Tom, you can explain that a little bit. Has that worked during the pandemic? And is that something like, might this maybe even be an export model that proved to be successful?
Well, I think it already has been an export model, because we used it in a lot of crises before, and in a large scale during the financial crisis 2008 and the following years. And the model works that there's some state subsidy for shorter working time over the period of the crisis, and then topping up the earnings for the workers. So there's a win-win situation. Workers have to work less hours because there's less work during the crisis. They still keep a decent level of income, which is quite close to the original income. And the companies keep the workers, especially for the skilled workers. That was very important. So after the financial crisis, German economy was really able to kickstart very fast because the workers were still in the companies. And this has been exported to all over the European Union during the COVID pandemic, and it was introduced by the European Union. Countries were supported to do similar schemes, and I think that is a very good model. But coming back to the viewer's question, what we see now is, even without any state subsidy, companies tend to really retain their workers, try to keep workers, because they know that they are running into labor shortages. And while the debate some years ago amongst HR people was very much about how do we transfer one worker we don't need any longer in our company to another company, and how to requalify that, and what role does the state play there. It's now really companies trying to keep workers in the companies, because they know if they lose them once, it's very hard to get them back.
I think that's a marked difference between the US and Europe. I think in the US, especially in large corporations and institutions, I think management is still operating on a neoliberal slash and burn model. And we've seen very, very serious layoffs in the tech companies that were only a few years ago thought to be growing limitlessly. So by the tens of thousands, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all laying people off. And that's part of the problem with the healthcare industry, is the corporatization of healthcare, right? So, one management corporation will own not just one, will manage not just one hospital, but, a chain of them, and then, cut labor as much as they can to the bone to try to offset other costs in healthcare. So I think it's a very unhealthy trend in the United States, but even with the labor shortages of the pandemic, it hasn't changed yet. And I think one of the only ways it's going to change is, as workers start unionizing. But I think we're at an inflection point, particularly for healthcare and for education in this country.
So that's actually a really good segue. You both earlier were talking about this as kind of a renaissance for organized labor. Annelise, you were just talking a little bit about some of the big layoffs in tech companies that are worrisome as a trend. We've recently seen hotel workers in Las Vegas go on strike. One of our viewers writes in and says that the Writers Guild has been on strike for weeks at this point. Now the Screen Actors Guild is considering a strike. Given high inflation, given the job market, given concerns over wages, is this a good time for workers to be going on strike?
You're the labor
Maybe
union
Annelise
guy, I'll jump in, but
Well, it is, and I think it's everybody sees the necessities there now with all the changes too. I mean, when we talk about all these changes through technology, etc., it's not the technology itself that is changing workplaces. It's how this technology is used. And you can fight over this. You can do it the one way, in a good way for the workers, or you can do it in a bad way for workers. So I think the situation with all these changes really demands having people organize collectively, and it's also quite a challenge for trade unions too, because we have to deal with greening of our economies, with new technologies, and then with the very traditional issues around working times and wages. So that's quite some challenges. But yes, workers need to organize at the moment. And I think the stronger unions are in Germany, in some sectors, unions are quite strong compared to other regions of the world. It's easier for them also to say in this crisis situation, okay, is there any way we don't, for example, drive up inflation through wage increases, especially in the better paid part of the economies? And we did some arrangements saying, well, there will be one-off payments this year and the next year, which do not, in the long term, increase the wages automatically. And this helps also dampen the inflation for the better paid workers. For the low paid workers, this is not a solution. They need this increase in the long run, because maybe their bargaining power is also weaker. But in the stronger sectors, we can say, okay, we will wait this 2 years. We make sure that people can pay their bills and energy bills and food bills and for the rents, and after that we can see where we stand. So I think worker power and having strong workers having a say is something that is very helpful in this situation of changes. And if you look at the German model, where our representatives even sit on supervisory boards of companies and talk about strategic decisions of companies, this is at the one hand very important to shape these changes, to make sure that if we move into a greener economy or a more tech-driven economy, that workers' rights are not left behind. And at the same time, it forces trade unions to be very very sensible when it comes to making sure that the company thrives and survives and has a long-term success. So it's not trying to get in and making quick money, quick wage increases, but we always have to have this overall issues in mind. So I think strong unions are rather the more responsible unions than the ones that have always to fight for only the next step.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I argued in my last book that workers' rights in many parts of the world, including the United States, have gone back almost 100 years with the evisceration of labor laws and workplace protections and, you know, the making almost meaningless the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is supposed to monitor workplace safety. And I think it's not accidental. I mean, 100 years ago was the beginning of a period of tremendous expansion of labor activism in the United States. And so it's not a surprise to me that we're back. I think people feel like they have no other choice. And I think also that here too, Gen Z led the way. So, well, it began with the fast food workers and the retail workers beginning to organize in the early, 2010s. And, and this latest wave came from the small shops, right? Relatively educated baristas in Starbucks and, Trader Joe's and Whole Foods and those kinds of places. And their strikes have spread to campuses. There are 3 new unions on my college campus in the last year. And so I think they kind of led the way, but now we're facing United Parcel Service national strike. It'll be the biggest strike in the United States in decades. I don't remember the last strike that will be of this size if the delivery drivers and the other United Parcel Service workers strike. So I think it kind of filtered up from small shops and kind of new waves sort of organizing to some of the big national unions. And again, things had gotten so bad with gig work and stuck wages and, disasters, safety disasters in the workplace that I think for a lot of workers, they felt like they had no choice. But also strike was a dirty word in the United States since 1970s, really. And what one young person who was organizing said to me is, our generation didn't get the memo that unions and strikes are bad. It seems like a good idea to us.
So that's actually maybe another good bridge, because we're talking about wages, we're talking about hiring, we're talking about some of the big challenges facing companies, but also workers. And I'd also like to shift our conversation and talk a little bit about the impact of digitalization and artificial intelligence, which both of you touched on earlier. One of our viewers asks, how do you see the rise of AI affecting hiring and wage trends in the years and decades to come?
I think it's very much dependent under which circumstances AI is introduced. I think it has a huge potential, not only to economically, and I think that is important too, because we need a strong economy to have more jobs and good jobs too, but also can be used to make work more meaningful and fulfilling if you have the routine tasks that are taken over by artificial intelligence systems. But at the same time, of course, there are a lot of risks. Having a complete supervision of workers, having problems of data. We've seen that Tesla workers' data have been spread over the internet, etc. We have issues around that AI is trained on what is on the internet and picks up all the biases we have in the internet. And if they are hiring people and the managers have always been white male, then AI will not diminish these biases, but repeat them. So of course there are a lot of risks, and so we think we have to shape them. And one is, of course, legislation. And in Germany, in Europe, there's the so-called AI Act on its way, which does a risk assessment of different ways to use AI. And AI in the workplace is always seen as a high-risk area because you have this power difference between the employer and at least the single worker. And of course, we are demanding as trade unions to having a say in the introduction of AI at the workplaces. In Germany, we have quite a good legal system because any system that can be used to supervise workers needs the approval of the works council, so of the local workers' representatives, but we also have to develop this knowledge, how AI is functioning, how it is used, and it's, of course, it has a changing nature. So you cannot just approve once, yes, you can use this AI system in the company, because this AI system will not be the same next year. So you need some mechanisms there too. But I think we have a general positive approach to the use of AI, but we have also very strong demands to diminish the risk and make sure that it's used to improve working conditions and not making workers only part of a huge machine.
You know, and again, I think it will hit different industries differently, but I think that was a super important point, Thorben, about the dominance of the tech sector by young white men overall. And so the perspective of AI is going to be very, very particular. And I imagine that will have to be grappled with in the same way that corporations like Google and Microsoft have started to, grapple with, to some degree, the diversity of their workers and try to bring in women coders, et cetera. But the other issue is, I'm thinking, you mentioned the Writers Guild strike in Hollywood. They are facing a situation where they're still operating on a 100-year-old model of writers' rooms, and the way that Hollywood scripts and series and films were written, and a combination of streaming, the new streaming technology, and then the advent of AI and limited series. All of it is creating a situation where they're facing possibly the extinction of their industry. So there would only be a handful of people coming in, because you could, do an AI chatbot generated or ChatGPT generated script based on the general idea of what you're looking for. And then you bring in, instead of a writer's room of 10, maybe you bring in 2 people who are seasoned at, at adapting that into, or refining that into, a somewhat more human script. That then changes what has already been changed, which is royalties, right? So there's a kind of work where people just can't afford to live. So this is an existential kind of threat strike. It's not just that we're not making enough money. It's, can we recreate the industry in the age of AI and neoliberal hiring practices and streaming in a way that keeps writers in the industry? I generally agree with Thorben that, we're just going to have more kinds of workers, which, we'll have more, software engineers and fewer traditional manufacturers, et cetera. But I think we're going to see, the devil is always in the details. And I think we have to look at different sectors to see how that's going to play out.
So maybe one last question for me, and then back to Katja. As we're thinking about sectors that are at, under pressure and under threat by AI, by digitalization, are either of you aware of any studies about, and this is a viewer question, but are either of you aware of any studies that have been published about how jobs that are being replaced by technology are then leading to new jobs being created as well, and what the opportunities are for those people, and what sort of prospects there are for national and global job markets moving forward? Annelise, you were shaking your head, you were nodding your head. So let me go to you first this time, and then Thorben.
Well, I'm not aware of studies. The one thing I would say is that I think it definitely is creating new job opportunities, but I think the recent round of tech layoffs has made everybody say, whoa, this is where we thought the jobs were going to be in this new economy. And those companies are cutting back dramatically. So part of the problem is that, tech changes so quickly all the time, right? And so what those new jobs are going to be change a lot. It's not, to go back 100 years again, everybody thought that assembly line technology was going to define everything for forever, and it did in many ways. But so yeah, I think the answer is this. It remains to be seen, and again, I think it really depends on the sector. But you perhaps know more detail than I do, Thorben.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at least I think one can say that the studies that only look at which tasks will be taken over by technology, and then from that say, well, all these jobs will be lost. This is not the way it works out. And there have been estimations for other technologies being introduced, which showed that technology or the newly created jobs through new technology at least are as much as the ones that are lost by the technology. And very often it's only parts of jobs and tasks that are really lost. So I think that is one important issue. The second is, of course, there are some large-scale platforms where these technologies will be used massively, but I'm currently looking into how this will be used by German, let's say, machine-producing companies, which are very important. There, as you can see, a huge reluctance to use the technology because they're all based on large public data models, and very often companies don't want to lay open all the data they use, for example, in their machines, because that is their innovative knowledge they have for themselves and they rely on. So there are limitations also to the use of AI, and so I think it's very difficult to say, and you can always argue, well, this is now the technology that will be completely different from all the ones we've seen in the past. But even if you look at a longer time of AI development, it has not been a very strong going up only. I think we are in a phase now where things are quickening up. We have to be aware of that, but I'm still not pessimistic that this will lead to huge layoffs that will not be counterbalanced but by some positive developments in other fields too.
Talking about AI and automation, where are the jobs? And Thorben, you mentioned the car industry in the talk a little while ago. Of course, that's also when geoeconomics come into play, and this is a fairly new concept. We haven't heard of that term for a long time, but now it's back to the forefront of our discussions. There's supply chain issues. You already mentioned that. Energy transition, especially in Germany, of course, that's a big issue. But it's also the question of migration and immigrant workers. So I put that all out on the table. We're running a bit short of time, but if you just want to comment on that, so how does the new geopolitical situation play out into all of this? Whoever wants to go first.
Go ahead. All right. The one thing that's on my mind is that we have, the last number that I've seen, I don't know if it's still in date, but a couple of years ago, is that it's 1 in 14 people on Earth who are migrating for work. And not just, some are fleeing violence, obviously, in their home places, but they're migrating for work in part because of the land grabs that took place around the world after the 2008 crash, because international investors thought that land was a more reliable investment than other kinds. And I think, in terms of food systems, it's dramatic. In the United States, I think it's over 90% of farm workers are immigrants. And I think that's going to be, it's true in many other parts of the world. So that is a piece of it that I think we need to consider. And I think there needs to be global policy around those laborers. And I know, there are attempts to pass new conventions in the International Labor Organization and the United Nations. So I'm going to be curious to see where that goes. But geopolitics, geoeconomics, and migration are a big part of it. And then obviously, transnational corporations, and the transnationalization of manufacturing is another big piece. So, the relationship between Walmart and manufacturers in Shenzhen in China and the Pearl River Delta is obviously one example. There were some estimates of something like almost 500,000 jobs in the US each year lost as a result of that. So, I mean, I think that's an area that we're all just going to have to become a lot better educated on.
Well, I think very often it's the same solutions we need there. When we talk about migrant workers, I think the most important thing is that they have decent working conditions, that make sure they have a decent living on the one hand side, but they're not undercutting local workers too. So I think the mechanisms there, and we in Germany definitely more migrants coming to Germany to work here due to demographics and labor shortages. And our approach at trade unions is never to try to keep these people out, but rather to make sure that they are employed on the same terms that German workers would be. And I think the same is true for local supply chains. And there, I think we see some kind of a dichotomy between an approach to weaken the global trade system and to mix every trade issue with security issues. In the struggle between the US and China, that is quite obvious, I think. I think there's reasons for the US to have security reservations against the Chinese government. But if you declare any semiconductor as a security issue, I mean, this is the technology that is running the 21st century, then things become very mixed there. So we see some block building and new borders developing there, and I think we have to be very careful that it's not getting that the world market is not getting too segmented on the one hand side. But then on the other hand, if we accept global supply chains also developing, there again we have to look at how are the working conditions, the environmental conditions, etc., along the supply chain. And that is why we in Germany supported as trade unions the so-called due diligence law. And we have also an approach at the European level, saying that a company that wants to sell products in Germany and in Europe needs to make sure that the working conditions and environmental conditions also with their suppliers and the sub-suppliers meet certain standards, at least ILO standards, etc. And I think so it's quite similar to how to deal with migrant workers, is to make sure it's not a problem if we have supply chains, as long as we make sure that at least some standards are met in the supply chains, and that our companies are held responsible if they don't make sure that these standards are met.
So maybe just a quick follow-up on that. So the care for workers extend basically beyond the immediate employees, but it also goes down the supply chain. Isn't that like more a task of the state rather than the companies, sort of to look into what's happening at the very end of the supply chain, maybe in China? Just curious if what you both think, if that's a task that might be too big for an employer sort of to tackle.
I mean, I think the state has to be involved. In the US also finally passed a law that you can't sell goods here that are made with slave labor, but that was not passed until the Obama administration. And it was only passed because of one of the most visible breakdowns in the humanity of the supply chain, which was the Rana Plaza factory complex collapse in Dhaka, Bangladesh in I believe it was 2013, when something like about 1,200 were killed and 2,500 more were grievously injured. What was interesting there is that law was passed in the US, but then worker organizing shifted to a slightly different view than you just laid out, which is that in fact it is the responsibility of corporations that buy from a global supply chain, because so they were looking at some Northern European corporations, H&M and Primark, but also Zara. So a lot of the big fast fashion producers in Europe we're saying, well, we're not responsible, plausible deniability, right? We don't know all these little garment shops all over, Bangladesh and Ethiopia and China, and we can't be responsible for them. And there was an organization of workers, of government folks, of ILO folks, and of consumers were really crucial in this, that got some of those big fast fashion producers to sign what has become a model, the Bangladesh Building and Fire Safety Accord, where these big corporations say, no, the little garment shop owner can't afford necessarily to make the repairs necessary to make the work safe, but we can. And so they agreed to guarantee that they would accept worker inspections of factory safety violations and that they would pay to repair them. We're seeing that now in electronics and chip production. We're seeing it in farm work. So I think it's an interesting model to keep tabs on in the future of labor and international manufacturing.
So as we watch those trends that you were just talking about, Annelise, I want to maybe ask about a different trend as we come to an end here and try to bring the conversation full circle, if you will. You both talked about how the pandemic accelerated some pre-existing trends and really fast forwarded some things that you both certainly saw on the horizon. One question that one of our viewers has is whether we're seeing an exacerbation of the division between manufacturing and the knowledge-based economy. Are we creating new divisions between blue collar and white collar workers in Europe and the United States? Some of those people obviously can enjoy a flexible work environment. They can work from home, but not all of them have, not all of them can. And so are we seeing growing divisions as part of this as well? And is that something that concerns you as you look ahead to the future? You were both nodding. I don't know who wants to go first.
I can maybe try to answer, but again, there are two sides to it, I think. Yes, there are a lot of people who work in manufacturing at the factory have to go there every day, especially during the pandemic when the risk was there. They said, this is unfair, we need to go there and others can stay home. And even after the pandemic, now they can stay home and I still have to go there. So I think we really have to think about how to make sure that blue collar workers can also benefit from improving working conditions. Maybe there are other measures not necessary, but for us as trade unions organizing both blue and white collar workers, this is an important issue. But at the same time, I would say there are also some trends that blend more and more manufacturing and services. When I look at a modern car, it's much more services you sell than only the product. And I think we can see this blend between services sectors and manufacturing sectors, and also manufacturing and services jobs when not really running a machine with the force of your body is any longer required, but more supervising a machine. Maybe that can be done remotely too in some years, or at least part of it, while some workers are there. Or if I have people controlling electricity lines, for example, I've just talked to an HR person from this kind of companies. In the past, people had to climb up and spend hours on this mast there. Now they fly drones, and other people are looking at computer pictures there. So I think we have both. We have this short-term trend of blue-collar workers feeling that they are getting out of sight and are not participating. But I think in the long term, there's rather a trend of blending manufacturing and services, jobs and sectors.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think that the division was quite great during the pandemic when so-called essential workers were forced to put their lives literally at risk every day to go in to do the kinds of service jobs that they did. But at the same time, I think there's, at least in the higher education labor movement right now, there is a a drive for what they call wall-to-wall organizing, so that, unions include, everything from, tenured full professors to dining services workers and custodians, and that's the only way, that we all have to see ourselves as workers. And indeed, my last book was called "We're All Fast Food Workers Now," and that was a line uttered by a history graduate student who was organizing graduate students and adjunct professors alongside home healthcare workers and fast food workers. And I asked them, how they came to that kind of coalition. It seemed like a different sort of labor coalition than I had encountered before. And the young man said, they tell us that our advanced degrees make us special, and that if we're just quiet, we'll get those secure tenure track jobs. He said, but the truth is, that's just a lie, to keep us quiet and compliant, because we're all fast food workers now. So yes, there's a greater division than ever, but I think there's also a greater overlap than ever.
And it seems like despite the divisions, there are also some opportunities, right? Moving forward. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this rebirth of the labor movement, and why labor is using these opportunities, as I think each of you have said, to try to get the word out and try to increase awareness. I feel like in the last hour, we covered an awful lot, but I also feel like we were really sort of skimming the surface, and that it was a race, and that a couple of topics came up short, particularly the social side of all of this, even though we did touch on it a little bit, but also the global labor movement. We didn't talk as much about it as I think we would have liked to. And so without having consulted with Katja beforehand, we would love to have the two of you back in the very near future to really try to do a double header in a part 2 and pick up on some of these issues, but also the many questions from our viewers that we were not able to include, even though we did include a lot of viewer questions. From my side, this has been a great discussion, and I want to thank you both very, very much. Many thanks, Annelise. Herzlichen Dank, Thorben. It was very informative, very insightful. And as I said, we'd love to do a part 2.
Okay, I'll look forward.
Yeah, looking forward to that.